can't tell.
Let's rehearse. Bad guy! Oh! Pretty good. The good guy wears a little target up on his vest. So, the good guy comes out and launches and cheers. Good guy! Ready, here comes the bad guy. And another bad guy. And another bad guy. What the heck is that? That's a half a bad guy. And another bad guy. Are you all ready for a gunfight? Yeah! Did you bring your guns? Yeah. How are you going to shoot back when we start shooting at you? Okay, then.
Hey, I still got more. Take him, Digger. Shoot over my head.
Well, it looks like it's just you and me, Wingo.
Well, shouldn't that be you and I?
Well, looks like it's just I and you.
The next one's going between your eyes. Oh, baby dog.
Right about one thing right between the eyes. That good guy wins in Tombstone!
Where are you loading your gun when you can knock a horse down with that thing?
I just knocked down a jackass. Folks, how many of you have seen the movie Tombstone with Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer? We have Bob Westlake with us today. He saw it too. And now we have Chad. Chad here now. He just saved a whole bundle of money by switching his horse insurance over to Geico. This is Brian. We're still trying to figure out what he does. Half fight. Another year or so, he's going to be fighting a 3/4 there. All right, then. Now, this here is Mike Jones. Mike Jones is a stuntman. Been run over by stagecoaches. He has done stunts in movies. Did you see Brokeback Mountain? He said the pay was good, but the stunts were.
Whoa! Folks, if you've got today, it's made by Richard Blake. There's no relationship to Robert Blake. You might remember Richard from the movie Raising Arizona with Nicolas Cage, Corbin Allen's version of Billy the Kid with Val Kilmer. Most notably, he had performed over 5,000 one-man Abraham Lincoln shows throughout the nation. Richard Blake.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this one. What?
Go to Western today.
Hey, you know what I found out about Abraham Lincoln? Now, he was not much of a ladies' man. He only had 4 scores in 7 years.
Yeah, but
Can I drool? I get tattoos for free.
Trying to get close up to that Zoom.
Sorry. 50 years I've been working on
Video?
That time of day, folks, at 1 o'clock, 6 City. Last day, reenactment. Right down here, folks. Children 13 years of age.
Across the road.
Most of our gunfight show is 10 minutes down here at 6 Gun City. If you'd like to join us, I would act as the show.
That's probably the case.
Just trying to get a picture of them legs.
See that?
You shoot me, do I get to shoot you back? That's a funny looking gun you got there.
Hey, last time I was here, I got arrested for using a camera.
Hold on, hold on, hold on. You doing that?
What happened to the rest of your britches? Sure. You're not going to bite me now, are you?
Come on. Very cute. Come on, come on.
No comprende.
A man by the name of Virgil. While Virgil and his two brothers, Morgan and Wyatt, they controlled the faro tables at the Oriental Saloon, which used to be in this white building on my left-hand side on the next corner coming up. Well, one night, Virgil, he stepped out of there. He was going to make his nightly rounds. He was on his way towards that Crystal Palace. He got a few feet off that corner there to my left when 5 shots rang out. And 2 of them hit their mark. Now, if you look to my right, you'll see the Longhorn Restaurant and Branding Iron. Well, back in the 1800s, that was a 2-story building that was under construction. And it was called the Huachuca Water Company. And it was from that unfinished top floor that those outlaws tried to ambush and murder Virgil Earp. Now, if you folks seen that movie Tombstone, you know Virgil didn't die from those wounds, but he was crippled in that left arm for life. Well, Virgil, he left Tombstone shortly after that. He went to California where he became a lawman again despite not having the use of that left arm. He then went to Goldfield, Nevada where he died in 1905 at the age of 62 years old from pneumonia. Now, Wyatt, he left shortly after that too. He went to California for a while, then up to Alaska when the gold rush was on. He returned to California where he died in 1929 at the age of 80 years old from natural causes. Now, Doc Holliday, on the other hand, he went to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where he died in 1887 from that tuberculosis at the young age of 35 years old. Now, if you look to my right, you'll see the Birdcage Theater. Now, that is an original building with all the original fixtures, bullet holes and all. If you haven't had a chance to see that, I recommend that you do. Now, the reason that all those famous people came here to Tombstone, like the Earps, Doc Holliday, Buckskin Frank Leslie, Luke Short, Bat Masterson, China Mary, Curly Bill Brocious, and Johnny Ringo, just to name a few, was to try and get rich off all that silver they were pulling out of those mines. And the man who was responsible for that was a man by the name of Edward Lawrence Schieffelin. Now, Ed Schieffelin, he was a prospector and an Indian scout stationed over at Camp Huachuca. And one day when he was getting ready to leave the fort to go out and do some prospecting, a soldier buddy of his said, "Ed, you've got to be crazy. The only thing out in those hills are Apache Indians. And the only stone you'll ever find is probably going to be your own tombstone." Well, Ed never forgot that. Then in 1877, he did discover silver in those hills. And then in 1879, when he incorporated the town, they called the town Tombstone. And that's how Tombstone got its name. Now, when they did get that silver ore out of those mines, they'd load them in them ore wagons. Now, they'd load them 3 at a time, and they would hold 12 tons of ore. And they were pulled by that famous 20-mule team. Now, we didn't have very good water supply here back then, so they had to haul that ore some 8 miles down to the San Pedro River, to a little town by the name of Charleston. That's where the mills were located. Well, the story has it that along the way, some of those drivers would jump in the back of those wagons and start throwing off some of that silver ore. Then when they get out of work, they'd saddle up their horses, ride right back up the same trail, pick up that silver ore, bring it back here to Tombstone, and then they'd sell it to a dealer at a reduced rate. And they'd take that money and they'd go drinking and gambling at the Birdcage, the Crystal Palace, or one of the other establishments here in town. Now, we had 2 major fires here in Tombstone. One was in 1881 and the other was in 1882. Well, the one that happened in 1881, it started right over here on my right-hand side coming up. You'll see that American flag on front of the Silver Hills Trading Company. Back in the 1800s, it was called the Arcade Saloon. And one day, a couple of bartenders, they rolled out a barrel of whiskey that had turned sour. They were going to check the level of the contents before they sent it back to the distributor. Well, one of those bartenders had a lit cigar in his mouth. It accidentally fell out of his mouth onto the whiskey barrel. An explosion occurred and the fire was on. And before it was over, some 66 buildings had burned to the ground. Now, if you look to my right, then look halfway up the street on the left-hand side, you can see that tall cottonwood tree there. Well, that stands directly in front of the Tombstone Epitaph. Late in the year of 1879, a man came here by the name of John P. Clum. He said, you know, every tombstone needs an epitaph. So on May 1st of 1880, he founded the Tombstone Epitaph. Now, that was our daily newspaper here for years, and it remains in circulation today. Now, if you folks did see that movie Tombstone with Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell, you might remember the part where Morgan Earp was playing pool one night when he was shot in the back. Coming up on my right-hand side, you'll see an orange building there. It's called the Red Buffalo Trading Company today. Well, back in 1800, it was called the Campbell and Hatch Billiards. And it was from in there at about 10 o'clock at night when Morgan Earp was playing pool that those outlaws tried to ambush him from the back door and shot him in the back. Now, he died from that about 40 minutes later. And that all took place on March 18th of 1882. Now, this is Allen Street that we're traveling on. And a lot of these buildings here on Allen Street are the original buildings. Now, coming up on my right-hand side on the corner, you'll see Arlene's Southwest Trading. Back in the 1800s, it was called Colonel Hafford's Liquor Store and Saloon, or Hafford's Corner. And it was from in there, and then right here on this very corner here to my right, is where the Earps and Doc Holliday met, just before they took that famous walk onto the OK Corral. Now, they didn't walk straight down Allen Street here. If you look to my right, that's 4th Street. They went to the next corner, which is Fremont, or Highway 80. They took a left on Fremont, and they entered on the back side of that corral. Also, on my right-hand side here in the corner, you'll see this red and yellow building called the Old Time Photo. Back in the 1800s, that was called the Can Can Restaurant. Now, that was owned and operated by a Chinese man by the name of Kwong Ki. And Kwong Ki, he was famous for having a finest Oriental cuisine here in the Southwest. Also, on my right-hand side, you'll see that purple building called Tombstone Historama. Now, if you go in there, they've got a 25-minute 3D movie that tells you all the history of Tombstone. And it's narrated by the late, great Vincent Price. Also, on my right-hand side coming up, you'll see that large brown gate here in front of that tan adobe building. Well, that is the Allen Street entrance to the OK Corral. And that's where they tell you that famous gunfight took place on October 26th of 1881 at 2:20 in the afternoon. But in reality, folks, if you look to my right as we pass by the city park, look way in the back of the park there and you'll see that block wall. Well, just on the other side of that yellow block wall was an alleyway. And that alleyway was only 15 feet wide. And that's where the actual gunfight took place. It started in that alley and then it spilled out into Fremont Street. Whoa, boys. But you know, it didn't sound as good to say the gunfight in the alley off of Fremont. Tough up, boys. So between Hollywood and the newspapers, it became the gunfight at the OK Corral. Now, back in our heyday, we had a documented 600 Chinese living here in Tombstone. And that was taken from, we had a documented 600 Chinese living here in Tombstone. And they all lived right here in what they call Chinatown, or Hop Town. That we'll be traveling through for the next 2 blocks. Now, coming up on my left-hand side, you'll see that little red and black house there. Well, that was the home of China Mary. China Mary, she controlled everything that went on here in these 2 blocks. She was a member of that ancient organized crime syndicate out of China called the Tongs. Now, it was said that if you were Chinese and you wanted to work here in Tombstone, you had to go through China Mary. If you didn't, chances are you wouldn't work at all. And even when you did go through her, you had to give her a part of your pay just to keep your job. Now, China Mary, she also controlled that very lucrative opium trade here back then. If you look to my right, you'll see that RV park. Now, when they dug up the ground to put the water lines in for that RV park, they uncovered some of those underground opium dens. And a lot of that paraphernalia can be seen in some of our museums throughout the town today. Now, China Mary, she died in 1906. She's buried up in Boot Hill right next to Quang Key, and they say she died a very wealthy woman. Now, as you pass this next intersection, if you look to my right, and look way off out there in the distance, you're going to see that range of mountains out there. Well, that is what they call the Dragoon Mountains. And that's where that famous Apache chief Cochise had his stronghold. He was able to hold off the U.S. cavalry out there for more than 7.5 years. Now, nobody knows exactly for sure where Cochise is buried, but there is a monument stating that he's buried in those hills somewhere. And the story that was told to me was that so revered by his people was this great Apache chief that they believed that one day he would return to lead them once again in their struggle. So they said that they did something for him that they never did for any Apache chief before. They say they buried him in a secret grave that no white man could ever find. They say he's buried up there with 2 of his favorite war ponies and a cache of stolen military rifles. Now, you know, folks, the Earps, they didn't come here to be lawmen. They came here to try and get rich off that silver like everybody else. And during the 18 months that they were here, they were able to acquire some property and some mining claims. One of those mining claims was called the Mountain Maid, and the north extension of that claim is what we're traveling over right now. And they built their homes in the center of that claim. Now, we get to this corner, if you look to my right and look 1 block up on the left-hand side, you'll see that brown wooden fence around that vacant lot. Well, that is where the home of Virgil Earp stood for more than 100 years. And Wyatt's house is still there, but it's catty corner from that. I'm sorry to say, in June of 1998, some kids were in there playing with some matches or something else. They caught the grass on fire, and Virgil's house burned down in less than 1 hour. Tombstone lost a valuable piece of history that day. Now, the Earps, they weren't the only famous lawmen to be here in Tombstone. Back in 1887, there was a man here by the name of Texas John Slaughter. Now, they say old Texas John was a rough, tough, no-nonsense, hard-as-nails lawman that you'd ever want to meet. They say when he went out and searched for an outlaw, if he couldn't bring the outlaw back, or he didn't want to bring him back, he'd bring back their boots, their saddle, their gun, or something else just to let everybody know that he'd caught up with them. Now, old Texas John, he wasn't a very large man. He was only 5'4". He weighed 140 pounds, and he wore a size 6 cowboy boot. But even the most feared Apache chief of all time, Geronimo, called him that wicked little gringo. Now, if you look to my left there at that tan house there in the corner, that was the home of Texas John Slaughter. Now, as we make our left-hand turn, we're entering onto a street that is called Tough Nut Street. And I'm going to tell you how Tough Nut Street got that name a little bit further on down the tour. But if I could get you to look to my right for just a moment, you see this little white house here with that stone fence? Well, that was the home of Dr. George Emery Goodfellow. Dr. Goodfellow, he was an expert in gunshot wounds. Well, he moved to the right town, because he took care of all the participants in the OK Corral gunfight. He's the one who tried to dig the buckshot out of Virgil's arm and that bullet out of Morgan's back. Now, here on my right, I'd like you to take notice of this telephone pole sitting right there. Keep that in mind for a moment while I tell you a story about a man by the name of John Heath. Well, back in 1884, that was a telegraph pole sitting there. And John Heath, he was one of the most notorious outlaws here in the Southwest. Well, one day when he was in Bisbee, he happened to excuse me, he happened to notice that this one particular store by the name of Goldwater's had a large amount of cash on hand. Well, the reason that they had all that cash is because they used to cash the miners' pay vouchers when they'd get out of work. But John Heath, he came back here to Tombstone. He rounded up 5 of his buddies. He talked them into riding back to Bisbee and robbing that store, while he would stay behind and lead the posse in the wrong direction. Well, something in that process went wrong, because his buddies went there and they shot and killed everybody in the place, including a young pregnant teenage girl from here in Tombstone. And they nicknamed that the Bisbee Massacre. Well, when they formed that posse and they were out searching for those outlaws, it didn't take them very long to figure out that John Heath was in on it. They arrested him, then they were able to catch up with the other 5. They brought them all back here to Tombstone to stand trial. Well, John Heath, he masterminded that robbery, but he didn't actually participate in the robbery. So he was able to secure himself a separate trial, where he received a life sentence in a prison at Yuma. Now, his 5 buddies, they weren't quite so lucky. If you look to my right and look over that brick wall, you can see the top half of those gallows right there. There's a couple of hangman's nooses on it right now. That is where they hung John Heath's 5 buddies. Now, coming up on the right is the courthouse. And that's where John Heath was being held while he awaited his transfer to Yuma. Well, the people of Tombstone and Bisbee, they didn't think it was right that he got off with that life sentence. So one day they formed an angry mob. They came down here to the courthouse and they stormed it. They overpowered the guard. They went to the back where John Heath's cell was located. They grabbed John Heath from that cell. They drug him down the street and they hung him from that telegraph pole I was telling you about back there. Now, back in our boom day, there was over some 500 mines operating out in those hills. If you look to my right and look off in the distance, you can still see some of those narrow trails that they brought down, all that silver ore from those mines. And also, folks, if you go into the courthouse, you will see one of the most famous pictures in all the Old West. You're going to see a picture of John Heath hanging from that telegraph pole. And right next to it is his death certificate. Now, Dr. Goodfellow, he just wasn't sure what to put down on that death certificate. So he put down that John Heath most likely died from emphysema, which could have been caused by strangulation. Now, Tough Nut Street. It got its name from the second largest producing silver mine discovered here by Ed Schieffelin. He'd been digging and digging. He was about to give up. He said, I'll try a little bit further and that's it. Well, it's a good thing that he did, because he discovered the second largest producing silver mine here in town. And that's after he'd already discovered the first. But when he got done, he said that was one tough nut to crack. And that's how the street got its name. You know, folks, at one time there was over 100 saloons on the street alone. Now you wonder how they all fit here? Well, back in the 1800s, you didn't need much. If you had a tent, 2 whiskey barrels, a board to go between them, and some booze, you were in business. Boy, down the courthouse, they called it Rotten Row. Now, if you look to my right, you'll see that yellow building is kind of set back off the road there. Well, that's our Tombstone City Library today. Back in 1903, that was our train depot. And that lasted until 1958, when the last train pulled out of Tombstone. Shortly after that, they tore up the tracks, and then they sold them to Mexico. Now, as you make our left turn onto 4th Street here, when you straighten out, look to my right, and you'll see that light tan building. And then you're going to see that open sign there in between those 2 doors. Now, if you go in there and go in the back, you will see the world's largest rose bush. It's in the Guinness World Book of Records as being the world's largest. Now, that was shipped over here from Scotland back in 1885 to a young bride-to-be. They say she'd been homesick for her native land. Well, she took good care of it. She planted it out in the backyard, and it grew to be over some 8,000 square feet. It's 6 feet around at the base, and it stands over 10 feet tall. Now, that still blooms every April, and it blooms the white rose. Now, coming up on my left-hand side in the corner, you'll see that white building there. Now, that is one of the oldest buildings here in town. And the reason for that being, it's one of the few buildings that survived both those fires we had here back in 1881 and 1882. Oh, boy. Now, that white building is our Chamber of Commerce and our Visitor Center today. Back in the 1800s, it was our very first bank here in town. And it was called the Bank of Cochise. Now, there used to be a lot of hotels along Allen Street back then. Whoa, boys. That's all right. Step up. Coming up here on my left-hand side, you're going to see a little area where those 2 mine cars are sitting in the street. And you're going to see that little wooden sandwich and coffee wagon. It's called the Pony Espresso. Well, that is where the Cosmopolitan Hotel once stood. And that's where they had the Earps and Doc Holliday held under house arrest for 2 weeks while they awaited the outcome for that OK Corral gunfight. And they were eventually found not guilty, or back then what they called not responsible for that gunfight. Right there to my left. Now, coming up on the right, you'll see Big Nose Skate Saloon, where those horses are parked. Back in the 1800s, it was called the Grand Hotel. Now that was a 3-story hotel, and they say it was one of the finest ones between here and San Francisco. Where that saloon is located today was the lobby of the Grand Hotel. The Big Nose Kate, that was Doc Holliday's girlfriend. I didn't give her that nickname, Big Nose Kate, because she had a big nose. I gave her that nickname because she kept sticking it into everybody else's business. Well, I hope you folks enjoyed that tour around the old town today. And I sure hope you enjoy the rest of staying in Tombstone. Now please, watch your step when you exit the coach, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, folks. Up, 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 step up. Whoa.
Want me to do it right now? Yeah. You won't be there. Roll down.
That's Lily. You want to pet Lily? Are you the orange family? You're the orange
Yeah, 16 minutes till showtime. Last gunfight showcase. Now we're around corner 6 Gun City. 5 reactions. No, Joe's open. Bar's open. $2. Margaritas all day long. Come on down here up here. Watch me shot. Coming up at 3 o'clock down here at 6 Gun City. Okay. 5 different gunfights, doors open, bars open. Come down and have a bug watch in the park. Every time you get up and down. Oh man. We're doing 5 places.
Every time. That's what I married. A lovely lady.